So a good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are in the world, I think.
Good afternoon from Kuwait.
Oh, wow.
Nice
Yeah,
to see you,
how is
Alison,
it?
having exchanged emails the last day or so, and nice to see everybody else.
Yeah.
We'll just give it a few seconds for everyone to get in, but had quite a lot of interest in this grouping, so in a good way. Oh, Yannicka, nice to see you too. It's good to see everyone. How many more we got?
Wow.
Okay, we seem to have a fairly consistent number now. So are we good to go, do we think? Let's make a start. Well, as Helen's already said, good morning, good evening, good afternoon, as where you are in the world, and possibly also watching this recording as well. It is worth saying, just for everyone's sake, that we are recording this and we'll be posting this webinar, so anyone that's not able to attend, and we are aware of a few, can catch up a little bit later. A huge welcome to everyone, because this is an event, a moment that a number of us have been really looking forward to over the last little while. Because today is the launch of a new special interest group for ECIS, looking specifically at leadership of school culture. Even the title of the SIG is something that's been under discussion a bit, because this is something, and I think this is important to point out, that is very much the beginning of a conversation that hopefully will last for the next few weeks and months. For those that don't know me, my name is Simon O'Connor, and I'm currently in Dubai, hence the blazing sunshine coming from my right-hand side. I am the director of Deira International School, which is part of the AFEF Education Foundation, and I'm also Chief of Education for the Education Foundation as well. This is a start of a conversation. We are going to be looking at the establishment and the maintenance of culture in schools, and really looking at our common understanding and awareness, the relevance of this understanding and awareness to schools, the extent to which it can be influenced, if it can, and also how culture can influence us as well. So a whole load of questions. It is important, we really want this session to be interactive. We do not have the answers. This is something in terms of a topic that has become an increasing fascination for me over the last couple of years in my own school leadership experience, and has generated a certain level of discussion that really got to a point where we are today. So we will please do add questions to the chat if you'd like to, and we'll have an opportunity in half an hour or so really to start picking up those questions, but equally add your thoughts as well. But it's also important to note that this isn't the end. The end of this session is not the end of this discussion, and we want to really maintain it and to continue the momentum of this. So that will happen in a number of ways, but one of the ways is we're going to carry the conversation via the ECIS LinkedIn page, and I'll reference that at the end. So please do continue to contribute to that and share your thoughts. But working up to that, and I think the really high point, the end, certainly the next big destination for this, is the April ECIS Leadership Conference, which is specifically looking at culture and change. And the hope is that over the coming weeks in between now and that point, the conversation will develop to a point that we'll be able to collectively feed back something to the group at that point. So that's what we're doing. It's very much a conversation, as I say. And I'm now going to hand over to a couple of people, very good friends of mine who I've known for many years, who will be sharing in this conversation with me today, and ask them very quickly just to introduce themselves and explain how they are here today. So firstly, to Dr. Andrew Lee.
Hi, good afternoon, everybody. So I'm Andrew, and I've been interested in culture for about 20 years. When I worked for Marriott Hotels, there was a kind of a rule that your Marriott hotel should be more like the one in Sydney or Boston than the hotel next door to you. So there was a culture that was being designed and developed and implemented that would go around the world. And I've always thought that schools kind of have that opportunity, but I think every school I've ever been to has a slightly different feel, and there isn't much sense of brand or consistency. And I think not just in the schools themselves, but even within little pockets, kind of subcultures and subdivisions. I'm kind of fascinated by that. And I did a doctorate which looked at the psychological experience of organizational change on the perception of being included or excluded. And they were all cultural issues.
Thank you, Andrew. And Helen.
Yeah, hi everybody. My name is Helen Morgan. Many of you will know me as an ECIS facilitator, and I'm delighted to be here on behalf of ECIS today. Leading up to that, I worked in schools in the UK for over 20 years, and for the last 7, I've been working with schools in the UK and internationally, looking at leadership and teaching. And I think the thing that really interests me is what is the impact of culture on young people in school, but also on the wider community. I'm also really interested in coaching. Some of you I've met in coaching contexts, and I think one of the things that really interests me is how coaching, again, can influence and shape culture within an organisation. So that's kind of my my little peak of interest in all of this. Thanks, Simon.
Thanks, Helen. And just to explain my context a little bit, I mentioned I'm in Dubai. I've been now in leading schools in Dubai for 10 years, and this is my second school. And I spent 7 years running a school called Deira College, and with success. I mean, it was a very successful school. But when I joined Deira International School, there was a sense really that I wanted to take a different look at this, and look at, rather than looking at, for want of a better word, individual elements of a school, whether it's assessment, teaching and learning, staff wellbeing, to try and look at it in a more holistic way. And this has become a real interest of mine, because my hypothesis, and it's something that I hope we can discuss over the coming weeks, is that I think that the influence, or attempting to influence, an intentional culture can be a very powerful element for change. It is worth saying, as I say, Andrew and I and Helen have been friends for many years, and as I'm sure will unfold in the coming minutes, we don't necessarily agree on all elements of this, but I think we all agreed that it is a subject of interest, and something which schools would benefit from having awareness of. So I'm going to hand over to Helen, who's going to be facilitating this discussion, and yeah, over to you, Helen.
Thanks, Simon. I'm going to attempt to be really neutral in this as well. So some of you might need to rein me back, but I'm hoping that we're going to have a great discussion today. So, Simon, let's kick off with you and just think about, what do you understand by the term culture? And I suppose the question is, why do you think it's relevant to school leadership?
Okay. As I said, this has been a topic of interest for a little while, and increasingly so for me. And one of the things that I actually think is quite interesting is firstly the complete lack of any unified understanding of what is meant by culture, but also the various terms that can be used in this. Some people talk about school atmosphere, they can talk about school morale, some talk about school climate, some very deliberately make the case that school culture and school climate are different things. So there's not a common understanding of this. For me, I think, and I'm going to quote someone specifically about this, who said that it's the values, norms, beliefs, and customs that an individual holds in common with other members of a social unit of group. And the way in which we've certainly been using it at school is to look at these elements. There are the artifacts, the visible elements of a culture, whether that's the school traditions, whether that's specific cultures, specific behaviours, but also what lies beneath that, the reasons. Simon Sinek talks about the reason why. I think beneath that, these behaviours are the values which support it and lead to those behaviours. Why I think it's really interesting for schools is that, well, two things. Firstly, the commercial world has been looking at this for a long time and looking at organizational culture and attempting to influence organizational culture and recognizing the impact that can have. But I think schools often say, one of the things we dismiss things with is by saying we're not corporate, but actually I think there's a danger that in that context that you can actually lose things of value. I think that and involvement and understanding and awareness and an influencing of an intentional culture can be extremely productive. I also think that there are certain elements such as the development of social media, social technology, the pandemic, etc., which have actually acted as a bit of a catalyst for this. And the final thing is that if we get the culture right, I mean, one of the elements of a culture is that people feel content where they are. On a purely sort of economic level, we know that we're approaching an absolute disaster in terms of the numbers of teachers, simply from the basis of recruitment. If we can get the culture right, we can get have a workforce, a staff that is more content. And as has already been suggested, ultimately the impact of all this work is going to be on our students to ensure that they can achieve their best.
I mean, it's so interesting just listening to you there, because you touch on a number of things like language associated with culture, whether culture is visible or invisible in a school if it's hidden. And I think the impact of the pandemic on all that is interesting. Andrew, you're listening to that and you're coming at it from a different, if you like, context. What do you think is similar or different in the world that you've worked in, and what could schools maybe learn from that?
I think one of the things that happens in a school environment is that a culture emerges that separates that school from the rest of the world. So you'll hear people say, oh, from the corporate world, or we're in education, it's different. And my sense is that it's not really. I think if you lead a family, if you lead a shop, a hotel, a consulting firm, then the thinking and feeling about culture is just as relevant to if you run a school. It's probably more important in schools because you've got young people's lives and their future ahead of them. So being part of a culture that is powerful or inspiring can have a bigger impact longer term. So I think the lessons are the same, but they might have more weight in schools.
That's interesting. That's really interesting. I think that idea of, the weight of that culture on young people, and not just their lives within school, but beyond the school context, is really interesting. I suppose a question that circles for me when I'm thinking about this is, can a culture then, if it emerges, can it be managed? Andrew, maybe start us off on that. Can we manage culture?
I think there's a couple of approaches here. And I think this is how school leaders or leaders generally might think about change. So there's one way of thinking about change is in that change occurs from the outside, that somebody up top or somebody somewhere else decides to bring about a change and exercise that in the organization. It's called the watchmaker model in theology, that God sits outside the universe tinkering with the planets and kind of making things happen. So it's an external, objective engineering approach to change. So some people take that view with culture, and I think often trip up. Another view is that culture is organic, that it emerges in the interactions. So see if I can get the sentence right. I've been practicing it. So the culture forms the organization, and the organization forms the culture at the same time. So that reflexive, recursive nature. And I was explaining it to a friend in Germany who's currently in Starlight Express. And I said, so our relationship forms the conversations that we have, and the conversations that we have form our relationship. So this pattern is always ongoing. And I think that's really difficult to control, because you can only control one side of it. And in a school with a couple of thousand people, you can kind of control what you put out, but you can't control what's heard. There's a good quote in the Jewish book of law, the Talmud, that we see things as we are, we don't see things as they are. And I think a lot of that projections happen when thinking about culture. So can it be managed? It can be influenced, but I think it would be either arrogant or naive to think that you can manage your culture, because you're only in one place at one time. No idea what conversation is happening in other parts of your organization that might be influencing culture at the same time.
Ooh, that's an interesting one. And that's maybe a good opportunity to say to people, feel free to comment in the chat. You know, do you have the watchmaker view, or do you have that organic perspective? I'm kind of thinking when I'm listening to you about coaching, and you know, I think we all have often as leaders an inner control freak that we have to manage, and it's really interesting to think about, you know, our own self-awareness within that. Simon, what do you think in terms of whether a culture can be managed, and what Andrew said?
I agree. I don't think you can manage, because the sense of manage is that it's a complete task that you can sort of tick a box and walk away. I think one of the realities, if you, it's taking a school perspective, as you change your role in leadership of the school, what you're actually doing becomes actually less achievable. I was a history teacher. I was a head of history and politics. When I was head of history and politics, there was a curriculum to be delivered. There were assessments to be done. At the end of the year, I could, to a large extent, walk away going, I have done that. And when I talk to new senior leaders, I say that you're not just juggling more things, but those things that you are juggling become bigger and actually less definable as well. A school culture is so complex, as Andrew's already alluded to. I mean, not only do you have the holistic school culture, which I'm not sure you can actually ever fully measure for the reasons that Andrew's alluded to, but you have subcultures existing within it. I mean, to continue with the example I've just had, you know, my Deira International School, the maths department will have a different culture to the history department, which will have a different culture to the year 3 team. You also have sort of, in international schools, you have cohort cultures, people that joined at the same time. They will have a common understanding that's not necessarily shared by any others. You have corridor cultures, people that teach near to each other, share the same space, etc. So it is so complex. I think to say you can, yes, manage it, and to a degree go, right, it is now being managed, I think it underestimates the complexity. I think the thing that I've realized is at the very first stage is there an awareness of culture? Are you aware that cultures exist? Because what we absolutely know is that every institution, whether it's the hotel, whether it's the family, whether it's the school, there is a culture, and it is being influenced whether you like it or not. So are you aware of that culture? And do you have some insight, and I suspect you can't have much more than that, as to who the major players in that culture are? I think once you've established that, you can begin to influence it. And that's the interesting bit, is to how you can then, but it's this awareness. I've been teaching for really quite a long time now, and I don't think I've really, yes, I sidestep that. I don't think I've had an awareness of school culture for the overwhelming majority of that. I regularly go back and look at, so as I say, I've been leading schools from a director's position for the last 10 years. Quite often go back and look at what I did previous years. And looking back at senior leadership team sort of meetings in previous years, for many of those, we never even discussed it, not even mentioned. You contrast that with the last 2 years, taking the senior leadership away for an away day at the beginning of the year and talking about nothing but how we were going to influence culture. That's the change for me, simply because I became aware of this, I think, incredible force. That force has always been there, but I didn't really acknowledge or understand the power that it had.
Again,
Helen,
it's just, go on.
If I may, I think it might be worth just unpacking a bit, because I think we're using the word culture like it's a capsule that contains lots of stuff, and we haven't kind of looked at that yet. And I think for me, culture is the pattern of behaviors and communication of any type in an organization. So written, verbal, vocal, the position of desks, the position of offices, the position of the principal's car park are all symbolic of culture and are forming the culture and being formed by it. So then if we're all individuals communicating, having conversations, how might patterns form? And I think that's a really fascinating question, because patterns certainly do form in different groups and different schools. They attend to different things in their conversation. They ignore different things in their conversations. But there's a pattern that isn't controlled by one person, but emerges from the in-between. And I think for me, that's what culture is. It's the stuff that emerges in between that causes the patterns and is the patterns of communication in an organization.
Would you say that, sorry, I agree with you in terms of behaviors and communications and relationships. Would you say it's culture also includes the values that prompt those behaviors?
I've got a challenge with values because lots of organizations have their written values on the website. People are our most important asset, for example, and then have a lived culture that's very different to that, and lived values. So I think that values emerge in the interactions, that the real values emerge in the interactions. But you can certainly like throw the values in, these are our values, and they might influence or they might not influence people, depending on how firmly they hold their own values and their own experiences. So part of it could be a reaction against what's going on, or it could be pro. So I don't know whether it's positive or negative impact.
Okay.
I think that's really interesting when you start to think about the idea of the patterns that emerge, because I'm pretty sure that everybody who's on the webinar today is suddenly starting to think about the patterns of communication and behaviour within their own organisations. And I suppose the question that leads from that is, as a leader, how do you begin? You know, we said you can't manage culture, but you can perhaps influence culture. How do you begin that process of influencing the culture? What levers can leaders use in order to do that? I don't know who wants to start. Go on, Alison.
Yes. Hi, everyone. It's such a pleasure to be here. Thank you so much for inviting me. I just maybe give a very short summary of my experience with culture. I am actually in the rare role of being head of organizational culture in a new educational project that started in the pandemic. Of course, the worst possible time to start anything, but it's just amazing how high it is flying in its third year now. And I really think that a large part of the success is the organizational culture. And if I could just speak about that for a moment, I found myself when I accepted the job. I've been in university all my life. I've never been in a school. And so but I'm an anthropologist, so I have some connection to culture. And then I found myself head of organizational culture for this burgeoning, despite the pandemic, educational project. And I asked myself, how do I do this? What is this? You know, you don't know how to grab onto that amorphous animal. It's like you try to catch a fish in a flowing stream, try to catch a little, oh, I got it. Nope, it slipped away. So I actually faced the situation where I had to establish what organizational culture is for a growing educational project. And this is my third year, and it's going okay. And we didn't have the problem of, well, we had to change because we were brand new. We were brand new, and with a focus on organizational culture right from the get-go. So we didn't have to go from being an organization with no awareness of culture in particular, then introducing awareness. We had awareness of culture right from day one, to the extent that someone was hired as a senior leader to be head of organizational culture, namely myself. So how I proceeded, we have values, very important values that were established as part of the culture, and we are sure that they are maintained. And among them, there a little bit revolutionary for the region we are in, which is the Gulf. One thing is we notice it's kind of like DEI, diversity, equity, and inclusion. Very, very strong on that. And I think we brought up, the question was raised earlier, a few minutes back, like how to maintain that once you have your values. Well, how do you maintain that? Well, what we find, for example, when we have challenges to diversity, equity, and inclusion, we just stand for it so strongly. And
that's really interesting. And I suppose kind of 3 years in, you'll be in a position where you can start drawing out kind of things that you're learning from the culture. And again, it'll be interesting kind of over time with the group to explore some of those things that are really coming out of the group.
I can raise one point very briefly. Simon mentioned the power of it, that it's a force, and I have seen that force in action in no uncertain terms in a specific way. It is part of our culture that we hire top CVs, but we do not look at nationality or age or gender. And which is unique in this region. Usually they look at nationality. We have 61 nationalities. We tend to prefer, we're global. That our things that we're, 63, we just added 2 more. And we have many nationalities who would ordinarily face discrimination and be paid less than their peers. But it's part of our culture that we stand on diversity, equity, and inclusion. And it's a bit revolutionary. No one around here that we know of, very rare. It would be
you need to come to Dubai. It's actually pretty common in Dubai, but that's really interesting.
There's the difference. There's the difference. So we are kind of the new kids or revolutionary in that respect. Those who have joined who would ordinarily face discrimination, for them being valued, which is part of the culture, has been incredibly empowering for them. It's just like a new lease on life, and I have witnessed that, and it is a huge power to unleash their skills, their wish to learn. They'll work till the cows come home, because that's the power of valuing people.
Yes, I mean, I think the power of valuing people is huge, isn't it? And thank you for sharing that. Simon, there's a really interesting question in the chat there about beginning to maybe share some of those dialogues, reflections, and actions that you've taken to positively impact your school culture. And suppose that relates to the idea of the levers. I don't know if you want to pick that one up and just share with the group where you've started.
I think the first thing to do is to share a comment. Are people aware? Do people understand what we mean by culture, or have a general understanding of it? So that it's like one of these normal, a very common model in terms of school leadership is that it starts off at the centre, but it's also important to ensure that that is shared across the community. So we started off having a conversation actually in what we call the executive. So myself, the head of primary and head of secondary, and have shared that initially through the extended leadership team, but it's now a conversation with staff and a conversation with students and a conversation with parents, so that it goes through the community as something that we're looking at. The second thing, and actually I'm just going to refer to someone in the chat as well, looking at what we've got and looking at the positives, but equally, as Andrew's alluded to begin to understand how the behaviours that we exhibit, and not just, but for a whole range of things, can influence it. It's specifically not about saying this is good, this is bad, but just an awareness of culture and how it can be impacted and how it can be influenced. The ultimate intention is that we actually move to an intentional culture, so that we're actually trying to not manipulate it, but as we've said a number of times, to influence it. Every time that we have a senior, so I mean, I haven't mentioned it, but clearly this is an area of research for me. I'm personally researching this quite considerably at the moment. Therefore, every time that we have an extended leadership team, I basically update the team on what I'm researching at that particular time. So it's a growing understanding of culture. The other thing we've done is to look really very hard at the values that we have as an organization, but not specific. We do not have contentious values. They're fairly common, I'm sure. The 4 values that the school is based on are respect, integrity, collaboration, and excellence. But I tell you what has changed is, firstly, everyone at the school now knows that. How many times have you been to a school where they've got values? I've led schools I didn't even know the values upon which it was based, let alone worked in them. So we've made them far more explicit. But we've also begun to look at, and this comes back to Alison's point, the way in which we've got just structures within the schools and the extent to which they support those values. So, for example, do we hire someone, to use Alison's example, on the basis of their nationality, or are we actually unpicking to see whether their values are consistent with ours? Because if we're trying to build a community around a set of values and consequently a culture, possibly that needs to be considered as well. Now, you then develop an interesting point, which does culture then become an element for inclusion or exclusion? But we're possibly not going to get onto that now. So for me, the first stage is absolutely, are you talking about it? And I'll come back to those meetings, and I know Yannick has mentioned this. I worked in a very successful school for 7 years, led a successful school. We never even spoke about this. We never mentioned mission. We never mentioned values. We never mentioned, and as I say, it worked well. But when I left that school, there was a sense that there was a bit untouched. And for me, this is it. And I think the power for me is that actually, if you can get this bit right, an awful lot of it falls into place elsewhere.
Yeah, I think there's some really interesting kind of comments coming through the chat that resonate with what you're talking about there as well, about, starting where you're actually at, and acknowledging what exists. And I think, again, that's a really insightful share from Mohammed, because I think for me, often we don't actually look at where we are and build from that point or move from that point. Kirsty, you talked about making processes explicit, and that really kind of links with building that awareness. We've got definitions of culture coming through. And Simon, you touched on the idea there of belonging as well. Do people feel part of it and not? Andrew, you're kind of hearing all of this and reading the chat. What's circling for you at the minute?
There's a desire to agree. So I'm kind of skimming, and we've got lots of stuff about the values, and a comment that culture starts with the head. And I just know lots of heads who've pulled their hair out because of the culture in the school they've inherited. Because I think, in fact, it's a well-known quote, isn't it, that culture, an old culture, can just destroy a new strategy. He says, eats it for breakfast. So what's going on? How do you influence that? How do you manage that if you're walking into a school as a head for the first time, when there are patterns of behaviour that have existed and exert quite a lot of control over the people who work there?
And that's the point that you made earlier, Andrew, isn't it? And I agree. In a perfect world, absolutely, the head that sets the culture and then establishes it, models it, behaves it, etc. But you've also got to remember that if a culture, and another thing is the type of culture that can emerge. And we've all known schools that, and I refuse to believe that any school leader sets out to establish a toxic culture in their school. But we all know schools where there is unquestionably a toxic culture that exists, possibly in a small part of the school, possibly across the school. Why is that happening? Well, it's the point that Andrew made earlier, that yes, someone can influence the culture, but similarly, if it's strong enough and powerful enough and embedded enough, that culture can then come back and control the person. And that can be the head teacher. Yeah, absolutely. In a perfect world, we can influence it, but we have to be aware of the fact it can influence us as well, and will be influencing us inevitably.
So what are the kind of, if you like, the dangers of ignoring the culture in a school?
Well, it's exactly that. For me, is that there is always going to be a culture, and you can either be aware of it or not. if you're aware of it, you can attempt to influence. If not, someone else will be, and someone else will be influencing it, whatever. But I think you can try and take some lead in the influence of it. Head teachers are in a very rare position that we have that position to make a strong contribution to that influence. But you've got to think about governors. It's an interesting question. Where do values and culture come from? Is it from the head? Is it from governors? Is it from parents? And the answer to inevitably is going to be all of those. But I think the advantages are that you can have an influence. The advantage of the disadvantages, if you fail to do so, is that someone else, or that control is elsewhere. But secondly, I do think, and possibly we're not going to get onto this as much today, maybe in the next session, there are clear advantages to doing this in terms of the leadership of the school. If you're not influencing culture, you're not getting the benefits of those.
Okay, so kind of you've outlined a number of disadvantages. Andrew, I'm going to come to you and say, what do you think are the advantages of influencing culture and taking steps? Any thoughts from you on that?
Yeah, I think if it can be done and it's successful in terms of aligning the thoughts and patterns of behavior across the whole organization, kind of written, verbal, symbolic, then the organization has the chance of being better aligned, which means that it will achieve things more quickly, it'll achieve things more cheaply, and it'll achieve a better quality without the tussles that can happen all over. But it's interesting here to notice that we're not talking about what sort of culture we're trying to influence towards. We don't have a very clear bullseye. We've mentioned something about valuing people. There's lots of research. I've done some at the University of Chicago, which shows that the highest performing organizations start with valuing people, then have critical thinking, then seize opportunities. So are those the things we're looking to influence? Or what sort of culture are we moving to? And how do you move culture? I remember when I was studying, having a moment of inspiration, thinking I'd invented a new subject. And my subject was organizational sociology, which felt much more valuable than organizational psychology, which looked at the individual. And I guess Alison would have looked at organizational anthropology, which is probably even more relevant to an organization in terms of the habits and patterns and ways of being together that human beings have. So
we have culture in spades. We have the organizational culture and school culture, and then we have the cultures of the globe also going on. You know, the meaning of culture in anthropology. If anyone has ever taken an anthropology course, and you take, you know, cultures of Mesoamerica, or it's just what Simon said: the values, norms, beliefs, customs held in common by various regional cultures, whether the Arab world or wherever, and the organizational culture of an organization is it's the same. And so yes, culture in spades.
So if I may, can I just add a couple of things in terms of how I think culture may develop? Because something seems to happen that's out of the control of the individual, and it emerges between. And I think some of the things that happen are that there are loops in the organization, there are amplifying loops. So if you mention a topic that is ready to be amplified, like safeguarding, if you mention safeguarding, then everybody stops and it's incredibly important and is amplified in the system. But there might be other things that are dampened in the system. And for me, it kind of looks like waves on the sea, things going up and things going down, things are being quashed. All those new teachers that all came from Ireland, they're all very young, aren't they? We won't listen to them yet. They need to get a good couple of years under their belt. And just in that sentence, you've squashed the contribution of a group of people because it hits a dampening loop, or things that might be amplified in a school situation might be things that KHDA say just in passing, and suddenly it hits an amplifying loop, and it's changing the way that schools operate in the UAE because someone at KHDA mentioned it. So things get amplified and things get dampened. And I think it's worth us noticing what we seem to dampen and amplify in our organizations, in our schools. And I know even here setting up this, Simon and I have been mates for a very long time. And we kind of deliberately set out to have different views here, because I studied at a different school to where Simon is. And there's a real encouragement in ECIS, which I adore, to find agreement and not upset the boat. So I just notice how even in conversations about culture is already emerging in it. So you get this kind of wheels within wheels.
But I think the point you came up with is the next step really in this, is that having established an awareness, having an understanding that behaviours will influence that culture. And I'm coming back to the point that Yannicka made about what kind of things we discussed in SLT, an open kind of culture about, an open discussion, which is what kind of culture do you want? Because there is a full spectrum. I firmly believe that toxic culture is rarely, if ever, deliberate. But what do you want it to be? Do you want it to be a culture which is with people at the forefront and valuing those? And I already alluded to one of the benefits, which sounds quite sort of Machiavellian in terms of maintaining staff. But if I'm being Machiavellian by keeping staff happy or working to keep staff happy so they'll stay here, I don't think that's the biggest crime I'll ever commit. But what kind of, now we've gone down a line, and I think again we'll talk about this in the next session. We are trying to get a very much a collaborative culture where, and someone's already referred to this about people like me actually not releasing control, but recognizing the limitations of what we can do. We've talked about servant leadership, ensuring that basically the role of the leadership is to support the staff, etc., etc. So we did actually map that quite specifically, what kind of culture and the behaviors as a consequence that we would then have to display to support this. We talk about transparency, we talk about the consistency of respect in all areas of the school. So I do think that's an important next discussion. Once that awareness of the two elements, number one, what is culture? Do you even know it exists? Another important thing is to try and measure it. Now, I so far in my, and I'd be interested, Andrew and I haven't discussed this, I'm not convinced you can actually. The complexity of a culture is such that I don't think you can measure it to it. There's some interesting devices out there. And I know that some institutions do try to specifically measure, we were 1.3 this year, we were 1.6 next year, etc. I'm not convinced about that, but do certainly, and this is part of engaging others in that conversation. If you're trying to have a transparent culture, which everyone is aware of, they should be involved in that as well. Again, it's also important that we talk about, I saw a nice thing the other day which said you have senior leaders, middle leaders, and other leaders. Is any teacher not a leader? But leaders throughout the school need to be aware of the culture in which they're working and the way in which their behaviours will contribute to it as well. But certainly beginning to talk about what kind of culture you would like the school to be, I think is a good bit. Good way.
Interesting. And I think that unpacking that, I think probably kind of just in the interests of time as well, it's quite interesting to kind of come over to some of the comments maybe in the chat, and to look at a couple of things that are emerging. First, am I pronouncing your name correctly? That's my first question. Yeah.
Yeah, my name's Shirsty.
Okay, so you have made a couple of comments, and Sarah's commented on it as well, that kind of allude to kind of the need for the leader to be prepared to relinquish control and not feel like they have to have all of the answers, and actually to let people within the organisation play a part in shaping the culture, but also that idea of braving difficult and uncomfortable conversations. So as Sarah said, that element of really developing that sense of psychological safety. I don't know if you want to talk a little bit more about that.
Sure, I can say a few words because, I'm in Germany currently, and I've been working 15 years in education here, mostly in early childhood, for German local kindergartens as well as international schools. And 11 years in leadership, I had that transition where my first experience was I came in and said, oh, sorry, I have a cold. I sound a bit funny. where I came in and I said, this is how we're going to work together. This is the behaviors we're going to have. This is our communication structure. And of course, the people that I brought in, it was a startup. So they tried really hard to impress, but it wasn't all their culture. It wasn't where they were coming from as individuals. And so when I took on my second leadership role, I instead started talking to the people that were working there. It had been running for 5 years, the program. And I started with one-on-one conversations, just listening to what some of the needs and interests were. And I didn't come in with, we're going to move the program for the children, we're going to move the behaviors around planning and curriculum, we're going to move it this way. I came in more listening to what they had been doing and where they wanted to go. And of course, everyone was a bit different. But the basic was, no one said, we want this to be a shit program. We want children to fail, and let's make this a horrible place to work. And once you realize that, in education, you're never going to hear that you can sit back as a leader, take in all the pictures, the pieces that you get, and then see, yes, the resources, what can we do? And then where's that difficult piece? So for example, we had communication with one another in the team. And so I sat down with them and I just put up a white paper and said, what is the worst way to behave to each other? What is the best way to behave? And all of a sudden we're talking about that and we're sharing some of our own experiences and hearing you speak too fast, or when you go into German and we don't speak English, this is how we feel. And in a good team, we would like this. And then the person says, oh my God, I didn't realize you felt that way. All of a sudden, we're setting values without me saying these are values, without looking at what the school has written down. We have in a 45-minute open session on how do we communicate, really touched a lot of nerves, made people uncomfortable, but grew as a team. And when you do little interventions like this, I took on later a kindergarten. A lot of people were calling out sick all the time. Those Monday, Friday sick absences, or 2 days without a sick note. And so we sat down and said, in a larger meeting, what does it do when you call out sick? How do you feel? Should you feel guilty? Yes, you should. And why is that good? And people were shocked that I was telling them I wanted them to feel guilty. And how can you say that as an employer? And then I explained it psychologically, why guilt is a good thing for us. And all of a sudden, but it changed. People started taking this to heart, and some of those behaviors changed. So it's big to talk about values, culture, but I think you have to actually talk about these little behaviors and pinpoint them. And that's what's going to give people the the starting place. Because if you just go into an organization and say, hey, let's talk about culture, people are like, what are you talking about? But
no, and can I come back to that? But that's been really interesting to listen to, because there's so many echoes of what we've done here. The crucial bit for me is, sometimes as school leaders, we have to ask people to do things, but it's the explanation of why. Why are we doing that? Now, if you can actually have, and again, it's such a overly simplistic perspective and a set of values to use it as a framework. But if you do have a set of values that are commonly understood, they don't have to necessarily be agreed with, though, frankly, integrity, excellence, it'd be just tricky for someone to come in and say, I don't really want to behave in a way that's demonstrate integrity. But you can then challenge with a common understanding, and you can explain things a common way. You've been talking about communication. One of the things we've learned is that I talked about stages of research. I'm looking at Generation Z at the moment, but I do think we have a changing workforce, and this kind of 20th century expectation of just implicit respect for authority has gone. People want to know why we're doing things. The other thing is they want to be heard. They don't necessarily want you to agree with them, because they're in madness lies. I've got 300 employees. If I agree with all of them, we're not going anywhere. But they want to know that they have a voice with it, that their voice is being heard. And that's to do with respect and to do with collaboration. So you see that we've got 4 values that actually can be attributed to and I'm not saying this is some kind of magic sort of brush that you sweep things away with. But actually what we're trying to do is develop a culture which answers that question as to why, so that people have an understanding. And we come back to the advantages. If you get that right, then people generally will know what you're trying to do and go ahead with that, if that makes sense.
I think that idea of kind of hearing and listening, and then what you do with that is really important as well. Just to kind of come to another question, because I think like there are some really kind of interesting things emerging. I know that Anya's dropped out, but she talks a little bit in the chat about the link between the organisational culture and learning culture in a school. And I wondered whether either of you have a thought about that or a response. Simon, I don't know.
It's kind of presented there as one or the other, isn't it? The learning culture or the organisation culture. And the culture is kind of like a messy primordial soup that's all around us and within us. So there'll be bits that pick up from the learning culture, there'll be bits that influence the strategic culture of the organisation. But I think we've got to be careful when we label things like this is our mission, this is our values, this is our culture, because we've all got a really different lived experience. And I think what we heard from Germany is that changing culture can be quite effective if you catch it in the moment. And as a therapist, if you work with a client, if you catch them doing something, they catch themselves doing something, it's an enormous learning moment. And I think if you can raise awareness of things that are going well or things that aren't going well in school conversations, then you have a chance of changing culture. But it has to be conversational. It can't be stuck on a notice board.
Yeah, that's interesting. Mohammed, maybe come to you as well, because we keep circling back in the chat a little bit to this idea of belonging and culture, and you've kind of identified that idea of people feeling distant or close to the organisation in relation to culture. I don't know if you want to say something about that, or if you have a question.
Firstly, thank you to everybody. It's a pleasure to be amongst you all. I think when we're talking about perceived, or what I've mentioned about perceived culture, I think something that firstly it came to me as a bit of a hit once I came into leadership, etc., a couple of years back, was we all have a perception of what goes on in the school, and listening to others is as has been mentioned, is extremely important to understand other people's perception of what's going on. So when we are like I said, what brings people, attracts them, and also distances them from the organization or the school. When we're giving people a job description, that is a perceived culture that we are giving to that individual. Similarly, when they come and they see a different perception, so you can see how it can really affect an individual and their psyche and their well-being, etc. So I think it's very important in our organizations not only to listen, but at the same time appreciate what's going on the ground, understanding what you have, because there've been places I've been in where the schools complained of lack of parent involvement, for example. But then I've been in another school where parents are always getting involved. So there's one place is complaining about not having it, and the other place is complaining about having it. So, and there's something, that's where really listening to these perceptions and looking at, what are the positives of these things? Do we really think about the positives? That one school, you've got parents involved, whilst the other school's worried about them getting involved. So building that, I guess, going back to what Andrew said about the communication and starting to perhaps, I think this goes back to an individual and starting that, theory of chaos, it ripples across, is perhaps getting these conversations started. It might start from the ground, it might start from the top down approach, but getting these conversations started, getting this ripple effect going, and getting people to think a little bit more, and perhaps that will bring, and for example, like you've done here, is to get these, it started off from something small, but suddenly we've come and it's become such a great thing we're talking about now, and different ideas have come about. And I think that's how you begin to start influencing a culture, if there's any way, not necessarily from a person, but it's when you start bringing these ideas, and then the ideas begin to create a lot more from what we want to hear from people, and perhaps bringing an understanding, okay, these are our values, but maybe some things that we perceive to be a problem could actually be a very important part of our culture. So those are the ideas that were crossing in my mind anyway. And again, it's a pleasure to be amongst you all.
Well, I think, Mohammed, for you to be consistent with your language, it would mean that you're listening to the ideas of other people, sharing them to influence at the same time as you're being influenced.
Yeah, I think that's that you're being influenced at the same time. Exactly. Yeah. It's that spiral which you were speaking about, Andrea. Absolutely.
Yeah, and that's why you can't kind of completely control it, but I think you've got to be open to it.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I can only speak about one example when because I work in Saudi Arabia currently, and I think for me one of the big shocks was when I came in. There's a quite a disparity from from the UK and then coming here from a different culture, if you want to say, and then coming to another culture. And the disparity came where I felt at the beginning I probably wasn't listening very well, and then when I started listening, then I started seeing, okay, these are the ideas that I need to really be thinking about. So absolutely, and this is why I felt that you can see how people you can either disengage as complete set of people, community of people even, but at the same time, if you listen carefully and also think about the point of culture, you can really engage people as well. So it's a very critical point. I think we're striking.
I think I start with the point that this conversation has never happened in the history of the world before, and that makes it special. Helen?
Go on, I'm just going to step in only because I'm really conscious of time. I feel like the conversation has been so good, we could probably have a week's retreat talking about this as a group. You know, there are other great comments in the chat that we don't have a chance, like yours, Sarah, about the capsule of the mission statement, that hopefully we can pick up as we move along, because often that's seen as a silver bullet, isn't it? Well, our mission statement is really good, so therefore our culture is great. But I'm going to pull it together and just say thank you kind of for contributions, and hand back to Simon to do the wrap up. Simon.
Well, thank you. It's when we started planning this, Helen, Andrew and I got together and said we can probably talk about this for hours, and I think this has been proved that if with your involvement as well, as Helen said, it could go on for weeks. We do actually want this to continue for weeks. As I've mentioned, if you see the ECIS LinkedIn page, and actually I'll put a link to that on the chat now. What we would like to do is to continue this conversation so that actually you can share your views around some fairly straightforward questions. But please do play a part in this, because as I hope has been clear, we're not sitting here with the answers. We've got a whole wealth of people here that can contribute to this. But very much leading, as Sarah's put on, is to note that this is leading up to what I hope will be a fabulous opportunity for people to come together and to continue this conversation face to face in the April conference that is looking at culture and change, and I believe it's in Dusseldorf. So thank you to all of you for joining us today. Thank you to Andrew for his insights and to Helen for her facilitation. I've enormously enjoyed this and resisted the temptation to keep taking notes so I can concentrate on what's being said. But let's keep this conversation going. It's been great fun and really, really interesting to hear everyone's perspectives. And yeah, thank you for coming, and enjoy the rest of your days, evenings, mornings, as to where you are. Thank you, everyone.
Just very quickly, I know not much has been written on school culture. There's the opportunity for us to write a book here, I think, if we took chapters each, or at least started with articles each, and see what emerges. But there's certainly a podcast in this, isn't there? There's probably a series of articles. There should be a book. Nobody's written it yet.
Be ambitious, Dr. Lee. Thank you, everyone.
We can go for 11 series. Thanks.
I can see a musical coming on, actually, I think, Andrew.
Oh, Sarah, that's the last thing.
We'll go for a musical.
School culture and a musical. That would be brilliant. I saw Come From Away again last night, but yes, it would, wouldn't it?
Abby, can you make sure that you save the chat, please?
Yep, I'll save it.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you.